All right, why good and evil paradigms are evil. I'm a big fan of the performative contradiction, in case you hadn't noticed. Obviously, a good and evil paradigm is evil because when you spell evil backwards, what do you get? That's right, live or live, depending on context, grammarians. And so evil is anti-life. Hmm? Hmm? All right, that's not actually a proof. Uh, I'm testing your rhetorical fallacies here. That's not actually a proof, but it is a pith encapsulation of what I want to present to you in my service today. So I got a joke and a pith encapsulation all at once. Uh, Efficiency here. It's 2-for-1 deals all day long at Reverend Fajun's Philosophy Emporium. So, evil, quote unquote, my famous air quotes, is anti-life, perhaps, because it's part of the tendency in us to fixate the world into something manageable. And that always, almost always, means reducing complexity and dynamism. So when we use evil and its partner, good, we like that one better, I think. But good, evil, these dichotomous ways of looking at the world is because we have an innate tendency to try to simplify things into a more manageable form. We do that by reducing complexity and dynamism. Maybe a good and evil paradigm isn't evil per se, but it is quite clunky and outmoded. When what we need are more adaptive ways to deal with nuance in our world of ever-increasing change. In our hominid ancestors, survival was based on the ability to identify other in a split second. Is this us or them in a split second? And then we could fight, fly, or freeze in response. This gave rise to the existence of things like tribal taboos. The history shows that we set up these, okay, now we know exactly what to do so that our brains can we don't have to think about it. These good, evil, self, other, taboo-like thinking are shortcuts so that in matters of survival, we don't have to waste precious time on philosophical conundrums, on nuance. This gave rise to the existence of tribal taboos, which were the precursors to our concepts of good and evil. While novelty is rewarded in our human brains, unfamiliarity signals danger. And woe to you if in this type of society you break a tribal taboo and thus become an other. Sadly, we humans still use this othering tactic to attempt to manipulate one another's behavior. This is the basis of shame. Do it my way, or I'll other you. And to our primate brains, being othered is equivalent to a death sentence. So we have the roots of good and evil are a survival mechanism. Worked really well for early humans learning to band together. One of the best ways to get your band to survive is to figure out who is us and who is them. What's right and what's wrong without having to think about it. But this type of heuristic, this shortcut in our brain, doesn't work as well in a world as complex as ours. What was once a survival skill may now be something that decreases our thriving as a species. Later, humans expanded this brain architecture through the great codes given by prophets and founders of the religions and the great walled city-states. This was 5,000, 10,000 years ago. By the power of incorporating together around sacred ideals, we gained the ability to stand our own against stronger tribal opponents. In the post-Enlightenment period, people like Unitarian thinkers and others realized all of the ways that these great codes were not universal, but highly arbitrary. The good-evil paradigm set up in the dualistic traditions of 5,000 or more years ago is sometimes like the philosophy that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's a philosophy, it's a shortcut for the brain that says we're going to divide the world into two halves. After you die, those who go to the smoking section and those who go to the non-smoking section. And those are the only choices that you have. And thus, we find ourselves in the modern age, set free in many ways from the bondage of these archaic codes, and yet still neurologically wired up for dualism and othering. Have you noticed that many of us hold very kind and inclusive philosophies until we're pushed too far? Have you seen this phenomena? Maybe not so much in this congregation, but if you're honest, like I try to be honest, you may have seen this in yourself. And I mean, if you haven't seen it, just go look at some comment boards on the internet. And wow, you'll see folks who, yesterday were sweetness and light, and then somehow there's a full reversal from good straight to evil in 0 to 60 seconds. Okay, what's going on here? A question, so this I imagine you'll also relate to, a question on our minds for about the last 5 years, perhaps, has been, when faced with horrors, do our UU principles of peace, unity, and inherent dignity hold up? Or were we better off with the ancient technology of finding out which side are you on? When faced with just an onslaught of human tragedies, can we keep the goal of world peace with justice for everyone, world community with peace and justice for everyone? Or would it be more efficient to go like, those aren't like me, we're over here, you're over there, and nary shall the twain meet? I think it's been a question for us for a little while. Do you remember back in the day? You haven't heard this lately if you've been in a UU community, but back in the day, people would ask like, hey, what do UUs believe? And people would go, oh, you believe whatever you want. I haven't heard that as much in the last 5 years. We've realized we've had to get a little bit clearer on what do we actually believe, because just a generalized campaign of sweetness and light doesn't hold up to the sometimes harsh realities of the real world. It's all too easy to default to slipping from the inherent worth and dignity down to name-calling, othering, and even demeaning entire groups in our minds. Although one of our 6 sources is words and deeds of prophetic people which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love, the low road in our brains doesn't do Master of Divinity level contemplations on what we mean by evil. It just snap judges. Sometimes the way we think, speak, or act under the influence of our sadness or rage can be a version of ourselves that we don't even recognize. This pendulum between an unreasonable hyper-inclusiveness on one side and a shadow of us-them tribalism on the other is unsustainable. It's time we created a better option. Well, fortunately, this is the part in my sermon where I start with fortunately. Fortunately, the question of which side are you on is often a Manichaean fallacy. Now, I had to delete the whole section of my sermon on where I gave you the history of Manichaeanism, but let's just say it was an old religion that posited that the world was a battleground between light forces and dark forces, and everything was either light or dark, and it gave its name to a logical fallacy which says that in any situation we lump things into either the good or evil camp, sometimes also called black and white thinking, dualism, or false dichotomy. So the good news is this question of which side are you on, not always, but often is a type of Manichaean fallacy, assuming that in every situation there's an all good polarity and an all bad one. And all we need to do, it's very convenient, all we need to do is choose which one we want to be with. Almost never are situations or people sorted so easily. If the discomfort of this above wasn't enough, I've got one more sales pitch for you about why I think good evil philosophies are evil. That sales pitch is demeaning others never looks good on peaceniks. Demeaning others never looks good on peaceniks. We've distanced ourselves far enough from these neural low-road tactics that when we try to use them, it just weakens our message. It looks like tribalism is more powerful than something like the goal of world community with peace and justice for all. So what's the other option? I personally have longed to find a way to offer the kind-hearted a way to express themselves which does not rely on archaic ways of ostracizing, shaming, and dehumanizing. If we don't have a method like this, we're stuck with an inner false dichotomy. Our only options are silence in the face of harm or violence. I believe that neither of these options is a road to the world we long to see. So the best tool, the one I want to share with you today, comes from the discipline of nonviolent communication. Don't worry, nonviolence can sound like weakness to some, but only because we're conditioned to the fool's choice of silence or violence. There's a third option available where we can speak from the heart with great power, vulnerability, and inclusiveness all at once. So principle number one in nonviolent communication is all about making observations, which kind of sounds boring, but it's extremely valuable. And I want to read to you straight from the tome, the book Nonviolent Communication by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, who shares a great story that's funnier than anything I could have written for this sermon. So let's hear from Dr. Rosenberg. I became aware of this difficulty between evaluations versus observations while working with an elementary school where the staff and principal often reported communication difficulties. The district superintendent had requested that I help them resolve the conflict. First, I was to confer with the staff, and then with the staff and the principal together. I opened the meeting by asking the staff, what is the principal doing that conflicts with your needs? He has a big mouth, came the swift response. My question called for an observation, but while big mouth gave me information on how this teacher evaluated the principal, it failed to describe what the principal said or did that led to the teacher's interpretation that he had a big mouth. When I pointed this out, a second teacher offered, I know what he means. The principal talks too much. Instead of a clear observation of the principal's behavior, this was also an evaluation of how much the principal talked. A third teacher then declared, he thinks only he has anything worth saying. I explained that inferring what another person is thinking is not the same as observing his behavior. Finally, a fourth teacher ventured, he wants to be the center of attention all the time. After I remarked that this too was an inference of what another person is wanting, two teachers blurted in unison, well, your question is very hard to answer. We subsequently worked together to create a list identifying specific behaviors on the part of the principal that bothered them, and made sure that the list was free of evaluation. For example, the principal told stories about his childhood and war experiences during faculty meetings, with the result that the meeting sometimes ran 20 minutes over time. When I asked whether they had ever communicated their annoyance to the principal, the staff replied that they had tried, but only through evaluative comments. They had never made reference to specific behaviors, such as his storytelling, and agreed to bring these up when we all met together. The reading's almost done. I hope you're still able to pay attention. Almost as soon as the meeting began, I saw what the staff had been telling me. No matter what was being discussed, the principal would interject, "This reminds me of the time," and then launch into a story about his childhood or war experience. I waited for the staff to voice their discomfort around the principal's behavior. However, instead of nonviolent communication, they applied nonverbal condemnation. Some rolled their eyes, others yawned pointedly. One stared at his watch. I endured this painful scenario until finally I asked, isn't anyone going to say something? An awkward silence ensued. The teacher who had spoken first at our meeting screwed up his courage, looked directly at the principal, and said, Ed, you have a big mouth. As this story illustrates, it's not always easy to shed our old habits and master the ability to separate observation from evaluation. Eventually, the teacher succeeded in clarifying for the principal the specific actions that led to their concern. The principal listened earnestly and then pressed, "Why didn't one of you tell me before?" He admitted he was aware of his storytelling habit and then began a story pertaining to this habit. I interrupted him, observing good-naturedly that he was doing it again. We ended our meeting developing ways for the staff to let their principal know in a gentle way when his stories weren't appreciated. So the difference here we're clarifying between observations and evaluations is a key if we don't want to just follow the neural low road. Oh, this is good, this is evil. Ed, you have a big mouth. This is a way in our minds. We're trying to figure out, is Ed good or bad? Well, he's got a big, what we're trying to say is I'm uncomfortable with something you're doing. And that ability to reference ourself, even our choices, our moral and ethical choices, can save us from the low road of dehumanization that is wired into our ancestral brains. Okay, so it turns out there's an easy way we can speak from the heart, stand our ground, and still not have to resort to an archaic worldviews that some are good and some are evil. If we hold off from our knee-jerk tendency to find a diagnosis at all costs and as soon as possible, we could actually make an observation. Evil is the inverse of live because we're not used to being with what's really happening, what we're observing, what we're feeling about it. These are high road capacities in our human brain, and they're definitely not cultural norms yet. Rather than the living dynamism and nuance, it feels powerful to fixate all of life into something dead and rigid in the labels that we put on others and events. Then we know what it is. We can get our hands on it and we can make snap judgments like the ones that kept our ancestors alive. Good versus evil, capitalist versus communist, Republican versus Democrat, vaxxer versus anti-vaxxer. It was a pretty good survival tactic with all its nuanced diminishing ways. But alas, it's a doorway to the past and not a path to the future. It's a vulnerable move to let go of the sense of power we gain by diagnosing another as on my team versus other. But we are most adaptive when we're showing up to reality as it is, not draping it in our convenient, unmoving categories. In the very best cases, when we hold back from assaulting another with our evaluations and pigeonholes, we can be pleasantly surprised. Rather than the vindication of a self-fulfilling prophecy, we can experience another as a three-dimensional human being, maybe holding harmful views or making choices we don't condone, but complex and multifaceted. Sometimes we even find a way to grow and change together. But even in the worst cases, by staying out of the good and evil sorting trap, we can move forward knowing that we've refused the fool's choice of silence or violence, and the false dichotomy born in an era long gone. So I hope you now are ready to convert to my philosophy that good and evil paradigms are evil. I've proved it to you by reversing the letters and showing you how evil is anti-life. But more importantly, we have a choice between low road tactics on our brain, which allow us to think quickly and sloppily, and high road neural tactics in our brain, which force us to think slowly, but with greater nuance and dynamism to survive in the world that we live in, not the world our ancient ancestors lived in.